Good day, so here's the report of Group 3, the CPU scheduling. CPU scheduling is a process of determining which process will own CPU for execution while another process is on hold. So here's the outline of our topic. First, basic concepts, scheduling criteria, scheduling algorithms, thread scheduling, multiprocessor scheduling, real-time CPU scheduling, operating system examples, and algorithm evaluation. Here's the objectives of this topic. First, describe various CPU scheduling algorithms. Assess CPU scheduling algorithms based on scheduling criteria. Explain the issues related to multiprocessor and multi-core scheduling. Describe various real-time scheduling algorithms. Describe the scheduling algorithms used in the Windows, Linux, and Solaris operating systems. And lastly is apply modeling and simulation to evaluate CPU scheduling algorithms. Basic concepts. So first is maximum CPU utilization obtained with multi-programming. Second is CPU I/O burst cycle. Process execution consists of a cycle of CPU execution and I/O wait. So this process alternate between the two states, the CPU execution and I/O wait. Third is CPU burst followed by I/O burst. Lastly is CPU burst distribution of a main concern. So this is a system request to terminate execution. Histogram of CPU burst times. Large number of short bursts, small numbers of longer bursts. The duration of CPU bursts have been measured extensively. CPU scheduler. The CPU scheduler selects from among the processes in ready queue and allocates a CPU core to one of them. Queue may be ordered in various ways. The main task of CPU scheduling is to make sure that whenever the CPU remains idle, the OS at least select one of the processes available in the ready queue for execution. CPU scheduling decisions may take place when a process first is switches from running to waiting state, second is switches from running to ready state, third is switches from waiting to ready, and fourth is to terminate. For situations 1 and 4, there is no choice in terms of scheduling. A new process, if one exists in the ready queue, must be selected for execution, and for the situation 2 and 3, however, there is a choice. There are two kinds of scheduling methods, the preemptive and non-preemptive scheduling. When scheduling takes place only under circumstances 1 and 4, the scheduling scheme is non-preemptive. So only condition 1 and 4 apply the non-preemptive. So otherwise, it is preemptive. Under non-preemptive scheduling, once the CPU has been allocated to a process, the process keeps the CPU until it releases it either by terminating or by switching to the waiting state. Virtually, all modern operating systems, including Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and Unix, use preemptive scheduling algorithms. So preemptive, the tasks are mostly assigned with their priorities, while the non-preemptive, CPU has been allocated to a specific process, so CPU will either release by switching and terminating. Preemptive scheduling and race conditions. So preemptive scheduling can result in race conditions when data are shared among several processes. Consider the case of two processes that share data. While one process is updating the data, it is preempted. So that the second process can run, the second process then tries to read the data which are in an inconsistent state. Dispatcher modules gives control of the CPU to the process selected by the CPU scheduler. This involves the switching context, switching to user mode, jumping to the proper location in the user program to restart the program. And the dispatch latency, time it takes for the dispatcher to stop one process and start another running. So dispatcher should be fast so that it can run on every context switch. Scheduling criteria. CPU utilization, keep the CPU as busy as possible. Second is throughput. Number of processes that complete their execution per time unit. So kung ang CPU is busy sa pag-execute sa process, mao na siya ang gitawag na throughput. Number 3 is turnaround time. Amount of time execute a particular process. Mao ni siya ang mo-calculate kung pila total ang time spent waiting to get into the memory ug sa pag-execute sa CPU. Fourth is waiting time. Amount of time a process has been waiting in the ready queue. Fifth is response time. amount of time it takes from when a request was submitted until the first response is produced. Scheduling algorithm optimization criteria. So CPU utilization and throughput is a max, and turnaround time, waiting time, and response time is a minimum. Scheduling algorithm has 6 types of process. So first is the first come first serve, or the FCFS scheduling. It is the easiest way and most simple CPU scheduling algorithm. It is a both non-preemptive and preemptive scheduling. So first come first serve. So we have the process P1, P2, and P3, and the burst time is 24, 3, and 3. Suppose that the process arrived in the order P1, P2, and P3. So ito makita dara sa Gantt chart nga natay P1, P2, and P3 and ato siyang gi-base sa process arrive. So waiting time for P1 is equal to 0. So mag-start ta sa burst time, sa atong waiting time sa P1 is to 0 and the P2 is 24. So ang 24 is mo na tong ang total sa burst time sa P1, and then sa P3 is equal to 27. So ang 24 gi-add na to sa burst time sa P2. So mo na siya 27 and yung total tanan is 30. So mo na siya tanan total burst time is equal to 30. So average waiting time is 0 plus 24 plus 27 divide 3 kay tulo man ato ang process, mo na siyang iyahang average waiting time is equal to 17. So here is the another example of FCFS scheduling. So unlike ganina, nag-base ta sa process arrive. So karon mag-base ta sa burst time. So as you can see sa Gantt chart, naadara ang P2, P3 and followed by P1. So sa P2, as usual, mag-start ta sa waiting time to is equal to 0. And then followed by 3 kay mo na ang burst time sa P2, and then sa P3 gitotal ang P2 ug ang P3 nga burst time mo siyang 6, and then sa P1 ang 24 mo siyang burst time sa 24 ug ang total burst time sa total sa P3 mo siya nimo 13. So waiting time of P1 is equal to 6. So nimo siyang 6 kay mao ang iyang waiting time nga mo na ang waiting time sa P1, and then sa P2 is nag-wait siya sa 0 and P3 is 3. So average waiting time sa ato ra total ang 6 plus 0 plus 3 and then divide by the 3 process. So mo siya equals to 3. So it is much better than previous one. So convey effects, short process behind long process. So consider one CPU bound and many IO bound processes. Second is shortest job first, or SGF scheduling. Associate with each process the length of its next CPU burst. Use this length to schedule the process with the shortest time. SGF is optimal, gives minimum average waiting time for a given set of processes. The difficulty is knowing the length of the next CPU request could ask the user. It is implemented with non-preemptive. So preemptive version called shortest remaining time first. So how do we determine the length of the next CPU burst? So could ask the user and to estimate. So here's the example of SGF, or the shortest job first scheduling. So we have the process, the P1, P2, P3, and P4, and the burst time 6, 8, 7, 3. So as you can see dira sa Gantt chart, nag-start sa lowest to highest nga burst time. So ato makita dira is first is the P4. So yung waiting time is 0. So yung burst time dira is 3. Then mao na ang waiting time sa P1. So ang waiting time sa P1 is 3. Then yung burst time nga 6 giadan sa 3. So mao na siya ang waiting time na pud sa P3 and so on and so forth. So mao na siya ang total sa P2 nga 24. So ang average waiting time is gitotal tanan ang mga burst time. So 3 plus 16 plus 9 plus 0 divide 4 is equal to 7. Determining length of next CPU burst. So can only estimate the length should be similar to the previous one, then pick process with shortest predicted next CPU burst. Then can be done by using the length of previous CPU burst using exponential averaging. So dara na to makita sa ubos ang mga exponential averaging. So here's the production of the length of the next CPU burst. So nadari atong CPU burst and the guess, or the time. So here's the examples of exponential averaging. Examples of shortest remaining time first. Now we add the concept of varying arrival times and preemption to analysis. So we have the process P1, P2, P3, and P4, and the arrival time 0, 1, 2, and 3, and the burst time 8, 4, 9, and 5. So this is the preemptive SGF Gantt chart or the shortest job first. So katong ganina is mo to siya ang non-preemptive. So atong makita dere nga atong giuna is ang P1, P2 followed by P4, P1 and P3. So ang first input nato sa Gantt chart is ang P1 kay mauman ang lowest arrival time, then gisundan sa lowest burst time which is P2, then iyang waiting time is 1. Kay mao ang arrival time, then gisum up ang waiting and burst time, mao ang total 5, then gisundan sa second lowest burst time which is the P4. Then gisum up na sad ang waiting time and burst time which is total 10. Then the third lowest burst time which is P1. Then gi-add na sad ang waiting and burst time which is 17. So kung nabantayan ninyo nga nung 17 siya, instead 18 kay naka-input na siya daan og 1 sa first box sa Gantt chart. Then ang burst time sa P1 which is 8 is na minusan nag 1. Then last is ang the highest burst time which is the P3. Then gi-add ang waiting and burst time mao ang total nga 16. So the average waiting time is equal to 10 minus 1 mao siya sa P1, then 1 minus 1 mao sa P2, 17 minus 2 sa P3, and sa P4 is 5 minus 3. So divide by 4 process is equal to 6.5. Round robin or RR. Each process gets a small unit of CPU time or the time quantum, usually 10 to 100 milliseconds. After this time has elapsed, the process is preempted and added to the end of the ready queue. If there are n processes in the ready queue and the time quantum is q, then each process gets 1 over n of the CPU time in chunks of at most q time units at once. No process waits more than n to the power of negative 1 q time units. Timer interrupts every quantum to schedule next process, and the performance is q large is equal to V4, or the q small is equal to q must be large with respect to context switch, otherwise overhead is too high. So here is the example of round robin with time quantum is equal to 4. So we have the process P1, P2, and P3, and the burst time 24, 3, and 3. And so makita na to dala sa Gantt chart no na P1 followed by P2, P3, back to P1, 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 and P1. So, ang waiting time sa P1 is equal to 0. And then, nag-input siya 4, which is the time quantum. So, mao na siyang nahimong waiting time sa P2. Dayon, giadan siya og burst time, which is the 3 sa P2. Mao siyang 4 plus 3 is equal to 7. So, pares po siya sa P3. Ang burst time is 3, then 7 plus 3 is equal to 10. So, gisundan na sad siya P1. So, ato makita dara yung waiting time is 10. And then, kung mabantayan ninyo, wala na ta nag-sum up or nag-add base sa burst time. So, nag-add na ta base sa time quantum. So, ang waiting time 10 plus the time quantum is equal to 14. And then, next is P1. So, yung waiting time na po is 14. Then, gi-add na po sa time quantum until nahimo siyang 30. So, typically, higher average turnaround than SGF but better response. Quantum should be large compared to context switch time. Then quantum usually 10 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds. Then context switch is greater than 10 microseconds. So here is the time quantum and the context switch time. Process time is equal to 10. Then the quantum, then the context switches. Also, mo ni siyang turnaround times varies with the time quantum. 80% of CPU bursts should shorter than quantum. So, this is the priority scheduling. A priority number integer is associated with each process. The CPU is allocated to the process with the highest priority. The smallest integer is equal to highest priority or the preemptive and the non-preemptive. SGF is priority scheduling, where priority is the inverse of predicted Next, CPU burst time. Problem is equal to starvation. Low priority processes may never executed. And the solution is equal to aging as time processes increase the priority of the progress. Example of priority scheduling. So, natay process P1, P2, P3, P4, and P5. The burst time is 10, 1, 2, and 5. Then the priority is 3, 1, 4, 5, and 2. So, mo siyang priority scheduling Gantt chart. So, first, nakabutang dara isang P2 kay mao ang priority. So, mo siya ang pinaka-lowest nga priority number. So, iyang waiting time is 0 and iyang burst time is 1. So, mauna po na siya ang waiting time sa P5 which is pangkaduha nga priority. So, ang waiting time sa P5 is 1 plus giadan sa burst time ni 5, mao siya imong 6. And then, mauna po na siya ang waiting time sa P1. Then, mao na siyang pangkatulo nga priority. Then, giad ang waiting time nga 6 sa burst time sa P1 nga 10, mao siya nahimong 16 and so on and so forth. Nga nahimo na siya ang P4 is iyang total is 19. Priority scheduling with round robin. So we have the process P1, P2, P3, and P4, and then P5, then the burst time 4, 5, 8, 7, and 3, and the priority is 3, 2, 2, 1, and 3. So round the process with the highest priority, processes with the same priority round robin. So Gantt chart with the time quantum is equal to 2. So, ga-start ta sa P4 kay mao ang first priority, then ang iyang waiting time is 0, then ang iyahang burst time is 7. So, mao ang waiting time sa second priority or process which is ang P2, then giad ang waiting time and the time quantum nga 2. Then, ang total niya is 9. And then, gisundan sa P3 nga iyang priority number is 2. Then, giadd ang iyang waiting time and time quantum. Then, ang total is 11. Then, ibalik sa P2 kay wala pa na-satisfy or consume ang tanan nga burst time niya. Then, giadd na sad ang waiting time and time quantum nga total of 13. Then, same sa P2, nibalik siya sa P3 kay wala pa na-satisfy ang maong process. Then, gi-add ang waiting time and time quantum. Then, ang total is 15. Then, nibalik nasad siya sa P2 but karon is na-satisfy ng iyang burst time. Then, gi-add ang waiting time nga dayon ang nabilin nga burst time which is 1. So, ang total of 16. So, nibalik siya sa P3. So, same sa P2, na-satisfy na sad ang iyang burst time. Then, mauni siya na himong 20 kay ang nabilin na lang nga burst time sa P3 is 4. Then, gisundan siya sa process nga P1 and then giadan ang waiting time sa time quantum nga 2. And then, ni-proceed siya sa process nga P5. Dayon, iyang waiting time is giadan na po siya og 2. So, same process ra siya until nga ang process is masatisfy na iyang burst time. So, iyang total is 27. Multi-level queue with priority scheduling have separated queues for each priority, then schedule the process in the highest priority queue. So, makita na to dara, priority is equal to 0, priority is equal to 1 until priority is equal to n. Multi-level queue, prioritization based upon process type. So, natay highest priority to the lowest priority. So, nadari ang 4 type sa process type. So, natay real-time processes, system processes, interactive processes, and the batch processes. Multi-level feedback queue. A process can move between the various queues. A multi-level feedback queue scheduler defined by the following parameters. So, there are 5 following parameters. First is the number of queues, scheduling algorithms for each queues, method used to determine when to upgrade a process, method used to determine when to demote a process. Lastly is method used to determine which queue a process will enter when that process needs service. Last is aging can be implemented using multi-level feedback queue. Example of multi-level feedback queue. 3 queues. Q0 round robin with time quantum 8 milliseconds. Q1 is the round robin time quantum 16 milliseconds, and the Q2 is FCFS, or the first come first serve. Scheduling: a process enters Q sub 0, which is served in a round robin. When it gains CPU, the process receives 8 milliseconds. If it does not finish in 8 milliseconds, the process is moved to Q sub 1. At Q sub 1, job is again served in round robin and receive 16 additional milliseconds. If it does not complete, it is preempted and moved to Q sub 0.